Amber Scott poured the wine without blinking. That was the thing nobody in the obsidian room ever understood about her, the stillness. The way her hand stayed level, her face stayed neutral, and her eyes stayed on the glass even as her mind was doing something those men in their tailored suits would have paid fortunes to stop. She caught the number before the sentence was even finished. 15%, buried 4 clauses deep, dressed in logistics language designed to put a very dangerous woman to sleep. She set the bottle down, smiled, disappeared back into the golden shadow of the room. And then she came back, leaned close to the woman everyone in 3 countries called the Ice Queen, and whispered something in Korean so precise, so perfect, that it sounded like it had been born in Seoul. Now, before we go any further, if you have ever been the person in the room that nobody looks at, the one they hand their coat to, the one they talk over like you are part of the furniture, this story is going to reach inside your chest and squeeze. Stay with me, because what Amber does next doesn't just change her life. It detonates it. The obsidian room sat at the center of a private district in downtown Seoul that didn't exist on any tourist map. You didn't book a table. You were granted one. The walls were black lacquered panels framed in brass, the color of old money, and the light came from somewhere low and amber, the kind of light that makes powerful men feel safe enough to say things they shouldn't. Crystal caught it from every angle. The air smelled like cold stone and $5,000 wine, and the quiet confidence of people who had never once in their lives been told to wait. Amber had worked here for 7 months. 7 months of carrying plates. That required more than her rent, of learning which silences were polite and which ones were warnings, of going home to a 1-room apartment, 3 train stops away where the only thing waiting for her was a hospital bill with her mother's name at the top. A number at the bottom that made her jaw tighten every single time she unfolded it. She needed this job. She needed it the way people need oxygen when the water is rising, not because it was beautiful, but because it was all that was keeping her from going under. So she was invisible by design. She was careful. She was steady. She was exactly what this room needed her to be, a warm body in a white shirt who poured and smiled and disappeared. But there is a thing about a room full of liars. Sometimes the lie is so loud, so clean, so obscenely brazen that even the most careful woman alive forgets to keep her face still. The man at the head of the private table was Silas Thorne, British South African, early 50s, the kind of handsome that had curdled into something cold and proprietary. He wore his confidence the way a snake wears its skin smooth, fitted, something to shed when it no longer served him. He had lawyer's eyes, the kind that never looked directly at anything they actually wanted. Amber knew those eyes. She had been seeing them in her sleep for 3 years. Across from him sat the woman the room had rearranged itself to accommodate. Seoa, no last name given. None needed. She arrived the way certain forces of nature arrive without announcement, without theater, and with an absolute certainty that everything in her radius would either fall in line or fall. She was in her mid-30s, dressed in a black suit that was architectural in its severity, her dark hair pulled back so cleanly it looked like a decision. Her hands, resting flat on the white tablecloth, were covered in ink fine-line tattoos that climbed past her wrists, up her forearms, and disappeared beneath her sleeves like a map of somewhere no one had ever been invited. Her neck carried the same story, quiet and permanent. She hadn't smiled once since she sat down. Her head of security, a man with the build of a door and the expression of a closed room, stood 4 feet behind her and did not move. Amber took their orders. She poured. She stepped back into the peripheral dark where people like her were supposed to stay. And then Silas Thorne did what men like Silas Thorne always do when they believe they are the smartest person in the room. He lied. Not clumsily. Not in the way of small men with small nerve. He lied with the smooth, rehearsed fluency of someone who had been doing it for so long that the truth had become the foreign language. He slid a contract across the table, thick, leather-bound, the kind of document designed to look like the final word on something. He walked Seoa through it in English, calm, methodical. His finger trailing down clauses with the ease of a man taking a morning walk. Amber stood at the sideboard and pretended to align napkins. Here is what nobody in the obsidian room knew about the Nigerian-British woman. Refilling their crystal glasses. Amber Scott had not always worn a white apron. 4 years before tonight, she had been one of the most precise financial forensic analysts working across the London Seoul corridor. She had a doctorate she had finished at 26, a reputation that had taken 6 years to build, and a father, Marcus Scott, who had taught her that numbers were the only language that never lied. Numbers were moral. Numbers were clean. The manipulation was always human. Marcus Scott had believed that until the night it killed him. Silas Thorne had come into their firm the way rot comes into a house slowly, invisibly, through a crack too small to see until the whole wall shifts. He had been a client first, then a partner. Then, by the time Amber understood what was happening, he was something else entirely. The man holding the ledger that proved her father had been skimming from a syndicate with very long arms and very short patience. The ledger was fabricated. Every entry, a careful forgery. The syndicate had not waited for a trial. They had come at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Amber had been in Edinburgh at a conference. Her father had been home alone. By the time she landed back in London, there was nothing left to bury except the lie Silas had built around his name, and the silence of every colleague who suddenly found it inconvenient to remember her. She lost the firm. She lost the license. She lost the savings. And when her mother Dorothy, warm and stubborn and the last anchor Amber had left, collapsed 6 months later from what the doctors called stress-induced cardiac episodes, Amber packed what was left of her life into 2 bags and followed the only lead she had. Her father's final encrypted message, which had named 1 city, 1 building, and 1 woman Silas Thorne had been quietly moving against for years. She came to Seoul, found the obsidian room, and put on a white apron, not to hide, to get close enough to finish it. She was at the sideboard when Silas reached the logistics clause. Section 4, Subarticle 9, 11 lines of dense legal language that would have put most people to sleep. She read it in 3 seconds. Felt something in her chest go absolutely, dangerously quiet. He had buried 15% of the entire asset transfer inside the third-party logistics provision. In structure, it looked like operational overhead. In reality, it was a private redirect straight into a shell company that COA's own people would never find unless they already knew where to look. COA was being robbed in real time. In a room she controlled. By a man she was in the process of trusting. Amber set a napkin down. Her colleague Ji-yun touched her arm from behind. Table 6. Manager's watching the floor tonight, Amber. Don't. Amber looked at her. Cover for me. Not a question. Ji-yun read something in her face, let go, and stepped back. Amber picked up the Bordeaux, moved toward the table with the unhurried, practiced ease of a woman who had been invisible for so long that the room had stopped checking for her. She reached COA's glass, tilted the bottle, and as the wine caught the light, she leaned in, close enough to be heard by 1 person and 1 person only. Her voice, when it came, was barely a current of air, but the Korean was flawless, Seoul district precise. The kind of Korean that takes years to earn and a lifetime to perfect. Your calculations are wrong. He is skimming 15% through the offshore logistics clause. She straightened, stepped back, kept walking. Behind her, she heard nothing. Not a gasp, not a movement, not a single shifted breath. But she felt it the exact moment the temperature in the room changed. Seoa had gone very, very still. And now, there was no version of this night in which Amber Scott walked out of it the same woman who had walked in, because Seoa's stillness was not the stillness of surprise. It was the stillness of a woman who had just found exactly what she had been looking for in the last place, wearing the last face. She had expected to find it. What Amber didn't know yet, what would crack her world open like a fault line before the night was through, was that COA had been searching for her for over 2 years. Not for the forensic analyst, not even for the grieving daughter, for the girl whose father had hidden something worth more than Silas Thorne's life, worth more than 15% of any contract, worth more than everything currently on that table. The Black Ledger. And now its keeper's daughter had just voluntarily announced herself. The wine settled in the glass, dark, still, and red as everything that was about to come. Before we go any further, if you're already hooked, hit subscribe right now. Because the woman who just leaned across that restaurant table and whispered the truth into Sioa's ear. She has no idea what she just walked into. And neither do you. Turn on notifications. The next chapter drops soon, and what happens in that black sedan changes everything. The words Amber whispered settled into Sioa's bloodstream like ice water, slow, deliberate, spreading cold certainty through every vein. She did not move, did not blink. Her pen hovered half an inch above the contract, suspended in the amber light of the chandelier, and the only sign that anything had shifted inside her was the almost imperceptible tightening of her fingers around the barrel, knuckles pale as bone china beneath her tattoos. Across the table, Silas laughed at something his associate murmured. That laugh, she had studied it for 3 months, the way it arrived too quickly, the way it never reached the crease beside his eyes. A performance. Everything about Silas Thorne was architecture built to deceive, and she had let herself believe, just briefly, that she had read the blueprints correctly. She had not. Amber straightened, unhurried, and poured the last of the Barolo into Sioa's glass, with the quiet precision of someone who understood that stillness was its own kind of armor. Their eyes met only for a second, but it was enough. A full conversation compressed into a glance. "I see you," Sioa's eyes said. "Then look harder," Amber's answered. Silas leaned forward, and his cologne arrived before he did. It was the kind of scent that cost a fortune and revealed everything thick with bergamot and something darker underneath, something ferrous and wrong, like expensive fabric draped over an open wound. She had smelled it on men before, men who smiled while their lawyers buried clauses in contracts the way gravediggers buried bodies, deep, quietly, without ceremony. "You've gone quiet," he observed, resting his forearms on the table. His cufflinks caught the light platinum, she noted. Monogrammed. The accessories of a man who needed the world to confirm his worth every time he moved his wrists. Sioa set the pen down. Not a surrender. A declaration. "Walk me through the logistics clause again." Her voice was silk over a blade smooth enough to touch, sharp enough to draw blood if he pressed. Subsection 4. The language around third-party facilitation. Something crossed his face. It came and went in under a second, a shadow behind the charm, a door shutting in a room he hadn't meant to leave open. "It's standard," he said. "Humor me." He smiled. Recited language that bore only a passing resemblance to what was written on the page. She watched him the way she watched everything, without urgency, without theatrics mapping every deviation, cataloging every carefully constructed half-truth. He was good. She had known better liars, but not many. She let him finish. Then she reached for her wine. The manager materialized at Amber's elbow like a bad omen in a pressed suit. Sioa saw it happen in her peripheral vision. The tight grip on her forearm, barely concealed behind a smile, the tilt of his head toward the back of the house. The language of dismissal dressed up as professionalism. Silas had noticed Amber's proximity, had noticed, perhaps, the length of time she'd lingered, and men like Silas Thorne did not tolerate proximity they couldn't control. Amber's jaw was set. She placed the bottle on the nearest surface with the unhurried composure of a woman who had long ago decided that the only dignity guaranteed to her was the kind she carried herself. Her spine was straight. Her expression composed. She walked toward the back of the restaurant with measured steps, unhurried. Unbowed, and Sioa felt something move in her chest that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Respect. And beneath it, something sharper. Something that tasted like rage. "She was excellent," Sioa said, her eyes still forward, still on Silas. "Overfamiliar," he replied, adjusting his lapel. Some staff forget their place. She let the silence expand between them, long enough to be uncomfortable. long enough to mean something. Then she picked up her pen. The alley behind the restaurant smelled of rain that hadn't fallen yet, petrichor and concrete and the ghost of kitchen grease, that specific sensory cocktail of every city's underbelly dressed in its finest clothes. Amber pushed through the service exit and stood in the gray mouth of it, the warmth of the restaurant's interior evaporating from her skin as the night pressed close. She had been fired before. This felt different. The black sedan was already there. No plates. Engine silent. Its windows the particular shade of dark that meant the tint was not factory standard someone had paid for opacity. For invisibility parked in plain sight. The rear window descended 2 inches. Just enough. A voice, low and precise. "Get in." Amber's jaw tightened. She looked at the car, then at the narrow corridor of sky above the alley, a strip of deep violet between buildings. She calculated the only currency she'd ever trusted. The door opened from the inside. The interior light revealed nothing but the edge of a hand resting on the seat. The hand was a woman's, the nails unpainted, a single ring on the index finger, gold with a stone so dark it swallowed what little light touched it. Purposeful, chosen. Not decoration, but a mark. She recognized it. Every person who moved in the orbit of certain names in this city recognized it. Amber stepped forward. The gravel shifted under her shoes, small sound, enormous weight. She ducked into the car, and the door closed behind her with the kind of silence that only came from engineering designed to seal the outside world completely away. The sedan moved. "You did well in there," said the car. Woman beside her. Amber turned. Seoa had removed her blazer. In the low dark of the back seat, the tattoos at her throat seemed to breathe, inked constellations mapping something unreadable across her collarbone. Her eyes, dark and direct and utterly without performance, moved over Amber's face the way you study something you've already decided matters. Amber held her gaze, did not look away. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "But you did." Seoa's voice dropped a register quieter now, stripped of the armor she'd worn in the restaurant. Something underneath it raw and more dangerous than anything Silas Thorne had at his table. That means something. Outside, the city peeled past in amber and shadow. Inside the car, the space between them was charged and careful, the kind of silence that holds its breath before something irrevocable occurs. Neither of them reached for it. Not yet, but it was there. Taut and alive and entirely aware of itself. The deal with Silas Thorne was already burning at its edges, and whatever was beginning here between a woman who kept secrets like weapons and a woman who had just proven she could be trusted with them was only just catching flame. The city fell away in layers. First the restaurant district, then the arterial roads with their floodlit billboards and late-night foot traffic, then the quieter residential corridors where the houses sat back from the street behind hedges trimmed to disciplined perfection. Then, nothing recognizable at all, just a private road that appeared between 2 stone pillars, the way secrets appear between polite conversation. Suddenly, and without warning, the safe house was not what Amber expected. She had imagined something utilitarian, steel doors and bare bulbs, and the particular grim functionality of a place built for necessity rather than comfort. What she found instead was a building that understood power far more fluently than that. A converted townhouse, 4 stories of pale stone and tall windows, where every light glowed at precisely the same warm frequency, as though even the illumination had been curated. As though chaos of any kind had been refused entry at the door. She stepped out of the sedan and the night air hit her differently here. Quieter. The kind of quiet that isn't absence of sound but presence of control, every variable managed. Every intrusion anticipated and neutralized before it arrived. Seoa walked ahead of her without looking back. She didn't need to. Her certainty that Amber would follow was not arrogance, it was something more unsettling. It was accuracy. Amber followed. Inside, the house breathed expensive restraint, dark wood, pale linen, art on the walls that asked questions rather than answered them. A fire burned low in a grate that hadn't been lit for ambiance. Someone had been here before them. Someone had been expecting this. Sioa moved to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of something amber-colored without asking. She carried one to Amber, held it out, and when their fingers touched briefly in the exchange, Amber felt the cold of her rings before she felt the warmth of her hand. Sit. Not unkind. Not a request either. Amber sat. Soa remained standing, which told her everything about how this conversation was structured before a word of it had been spoken. She turned to face her, and in the firelight the tattoos at her throat moved with her breathing slow, deliberate, alive. "I knew about the logistics clause 6 days ago," she said. The words landed with the flat finality of something dropped from a great height. "Silas has been rerouting third-party facilitation fees through a shell architecture in Liechtenstein. He's been doing it to every partner who doesn't have someone sharp enough to catch it." She paused, took a measured sip. "I have someone sharp enough." Amber processed this with the stillness she'd spent years cultivating the expression that had kept her employed in rooms where being too visibly intelligent was its own liability. "Then tonight wasn't about the contract," she said. "No, it was about the room." Sioa's mouth curved, not quite a smile, not quite its absence. Something between them, precise and private. "It was about you," she said, specifically. The dinner had been theater. Every element of it, the restaurant, the table, the wine. The contract laid open like bait had been staged, with the patience of someone who understood that the truest version of a person only surfaces when they believe no one is watching for it. Sioa had placed Amber in that room deliberately, had requested her specifically through the agency that contracted staff to the restaurant, a detail Amber would spend the next hour reconstructing in her mind with rising unease, and something else she wasn't ready to name. She had wanted to see if anyone would speak, not the associates, not the lawyers, not the men who orbited Silas like planets around a dying star, bound by gravity and self-interest. She had wanted to see if the woman holding the bottle would choose truth over security. Amber had. And now she sat in a firelit room with a woman who moved through danger the way most people moved through air, without remarking on it, without flinching, because it was simply the medium she inhabited, and tried to keep her breathing even. Sioa set her glass down and crossed the room. She moved the way the house was built with intention. Every step precise. She stopped in front of Amber, close enough that Amber could smell her perfume, something dark and dry, a scent like a decision already made. She lifted one hand, and the gold ring on her index finger caught the firelight as she traced the line of Amber's jaw. Cold metal, warm skin, the deliberate pressure of someone who wanted you to understand the distinction. Amber did not pull back. She held the touch the way she'd held the eye contact earlier, completely, without surrender, meeting it as an equal even when every nerve ending she possessed was insisting she was anything but. "You're an accountant," Sioa said. "Not a question." "Forensic accountant," Amber corrected. Her voice held. She was proud of that. Fired twice in 3 years. Both times for finding things your employers preferred unfound. Sioa's finger stilled but did not leave her jaw. "You are precisely what I have been looking for." The fire shifted. Somewhere in the house, a clock measured seconds that felt structural, load-bearing as though time itself was holding something up. "I want you inside my operation." Sioa continued, her voice dropping to something that lived in the space between professional and intimate, without belonging entirely to either. "Your eyes, your mind, your willingness to say the thing no one else in the room will say." "And in return?" Amber asked. The ring-clad hand dropped, but the cold it had pressed into her skin remained, like a signature. "In return," Sioa said, "you will never need to be afraid of the rooms you walk into again." It was not a promise wrapped in softness. It was a covenant offered the way all serious things were offered in this world plainly, with full knowledge of the cost, and without the insult of pretending that cost did not exist. Amber looked at her. At the firelit architecture of her face, the controlled stillness of her, the danger that didn't posture because it had nothing left to prove. She thought about the alley, the sedan, the way the door had opened from the inside like something that had been waiting. She thought about every room she had ever walked into alone. "Tell me what the operation looks like," she said, and Seo, smiled fully, this time. The first real one. It was more frightening than everything that had preceded it. The operation, as Seoa described it, was elegant in the way that all truly dangerous things were elegant stripped of excess, built for precision, beautiful in the manner of a blade rather than a flower. She spoke for 40 minutes without consulting a single document. Numbers, names, jurisdictions, shell structures layered over shell structures like geological strata, each layer representing a decision made in a room Amber had never been permitted to enter, until now. She absorbed it the way she absorbed everything, completely, quietly, filing each piece into the architecture of her understanding with the focused efficiency that had made her indispensable and, consequently, threatening to every employer she'd ever had. When Seoa finished, she poured more whiskey. "Your father would have understood all of this immediately," she said. The room temperature did not change, but Amber's relationship to the air inside it did. "My father was an accountant," she said carefully. The word felt insufficient the moment it left her mouth, the way a single candle feels insufficient when you're trying to describe fire. "Your father," Seoa said, setting the decanter down with unhurried precision, "was the keeper of the black ledger. Every transaction my family's syndicate conducted for 19 years, every acquisition, every debt, every alliance and dissolution existed first in his hands. He was the most trusted man my father ever employed." She paused. "And the only one he never fully controlled." The fire cracked. A log shifted. The world Amber thought she had been standing on revealed itself to be a floor above another, and she was only now learning how far down it went. "You didn't find me by accident," she said. "No." The single syllable was almost gentle. "Almost." "I've been looking for you for 2 years," Seoa continued, and something in her voice shifted a frequency beneath the control, something that sounded almost like relief. "Since your father died and took the encryption keys to every file he ever kept with him. I had been watching you long before the obsidian room. I knew your movements, your contracts, your mother's medical situation. The restaurant was simply the moment I chose to make contact. The confirmation of it, the full scope of how long she had been a known variable in someone else's equation, moved through Amber like cold settling into bone. "You want the files," she said. "I want what's in them, what belongs to my family, what your father protected so completely that the only person left alive who might reach them is the daughter he taught everything he knew." They gave her a room on the 3rd floor. It was beautiful in the suffocating way of places designed to make captivity comfortable enough to be mistaken for hospitality. Pale walls and tall windows dressed in heavy curtains, a bed dressed in silk, the color of deep water. Amber sat on the edge of it and pressed her palm flat against the sheets. Cold. Despite the warmth of the room, despite the fire that had been lit in this hearth too cold the way expensive things sometimes were, all surface and no warmth, beauty that had never been asked to actually comfort anyone. She lay back and stared at the ceiling and let herself feel the full weight of it. Her father's face came to her unhurried, precise, the particular quality of his silence that she had inherited, and only now understood the provenance of. He had taught her numbers the way other fathers taught prayer, with reverence, with ritual, with the implication that this knowledge was both gift and burden, and that she should carry it accordingly. He had been preparing her. She had not known for what. She closed her eyes. The silk against her skin felt like a sentence she didn't yet know how to read, elegant and cold, and entirely conditional. The room was a gesture. The gesture had terms. She had not agreed to the terms. She had agreed to hear the operation described, which was not the same thing, though she suspected Seoa was accustomed to the distance between those two positions collapsing in her favor. Sleep did not come. At some point past midnight, the house settled into its particular brand of silence, and Amber rose. She moved barefoot across the floor, old instinct. learned from a man who had taught her that information lived in the spaces between authorized moments. The hallway outside her door was empty and low-lit, and she followed it toward the staircase with the careful deliberateness of someone reading a room they're not supposed to be reading. Seoa's voice reached her before she reached the landing, low, controlled, in English rather than Korean, which meant it was for the benefit of the person on the other end, not herself. Amber stopped, pressed herself against the wall, let the words arrive. She doesn't know yet. A pause. The files are encrypted with a biometric layer she'll need to initiate access voluntarily. You cannot extract it. Another pause, and then something that made the cold silk of the sheets feel retrospectively merciful. Yes, Silas. She trusts me enough. Give it 48 hours. The name fell through Amber like a stone through still water impact first, then the rings spreading outward, disturbing everything they touched. Silas. She pressed her back harder against the wall and breathed with absolute discipline, the way her father had taught her to breathe, when the numbers didn't add up, and panic was the least affordable response available. The rescue. The sedan. The firelit room and the cold ring tracing her jaw, and the voice dropping to that register that lived between professional and something raw. All of it reconstructed itself now with Silas's cologne underneath it. Ferrous and cloying, present in every careful gesture Seoa had made. The dinner had been a test, but not the test she'd been told. She had not been recruited because she was brave. She had been harvested because she was useful. The protection offered was not a shield, it was a leash, extended with beautiful hands, and offered in a voice calibrated precisely to the frequency of a woman who had spent her whole life waiting to be chosen by a room rather than tolerated by it. Amber's jaw tightened. Her eyes, were dry. She had learned from her father that the most dangerous moment in any negotiation was not when the other party revealed their deception. It was the moment you decided what to do with that knowledge before they knew you. Had it. She pushed off the wall, walked back to the cold silk room. Lay down. 48 hours, Seoa had said. Amber stared at the ceiling and let the numbers settle into her like a key turning in a lock she intended to open herself, on her own terms, before anyone else got the chance. Her father had left her the files. He had also left her something else, something Seoa, for all her elegance and precision, had not accounted for. He had left her the wit to know when she was in a room designed to make her forget she could leave it. Amber was awake before the light changed. She lay in the silk-dressed bed and watched the ceiling shift from black to gray to the particular shade of pale gold that precedes full morning. And she catalogued everything she knew the way Marcus Scott had taught her to catalog discrepancies without emotion first, emotion later, because feeling before thinking was the fastest route to a decision you couldn't afford. What she knew, Seoa and Silas were in league. The rescue was engineered. The files her father had left were the target, and she was the instrument. 48 hours was the window they'd allocated before they expected her trust to be complete enough to exploit. What she didn't know yet, how deep the architecture went. She was about to find out. Her phone returned to her the previous night with a casualness that had felt like generosity and now felt like calculation buzzed on the nightstand at 7:42. A number she recognized, the hospital's direct line for the private ward. She answered before the second vibration finished. Miss Amber. The nurse's voice carried the practiced warmth of someone trained to deliver difficult information in tones that discouraged follow-up questions. Just your morning check-in. Your mother had a comfortable night. She's resting. She's always resting, Amber said. The words came out level. She had learned level a long time ago. The treatment requires extended rest periods, Dr. Osei explained. Put her on. A pause, fabric rustling, the ambient sound of a room that smelled, Amber knew from memory, of antiseptic and cut flowers, and the specific institutional sadness of expensive suffering. Her mother's voice arrived like something carried a great distance, thin, soft at the edges, words forming with the effortful imprecision of someone pushing through deep water to reach the surface. Baby. Hi. Mama, I was I was just thinking about your father. A long pause, breathing. I keep dreaming about him. Is he? He's gone, Mama. He's been gone 2 years. 2 years. The words dissolved into silence. That doesn't sound right. Amber ended the call. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the phone between both palms and did not allow herself the luxury of falling apart. She gave herself 4 breaths her father's prescription for the moments that wanted to unmake you, and on the 4th breath she picked up what she knew and arranged it into a structure she could work with. Her mother had been enrolled in the private treatment program 11 months ago. A progressive neurological condition, doctor. Osei had explained, a careful, gray-haired man with credentials that had seemed impeccable and a manner that had seemed kind. The treatment was experimental, he'd said. Expensive, he'd said, requiring careful management of consciousness levels to allow the brain adequate restoration time. Amber had worked 3 forensic contracts simultaneously to cover the cost, had eaten her lunches at her desk, had worn the same 4 blazers on rotation for 8 months without complaint, because her mother's clarity, the moments of it, the brief windows when the woman who had raised her surfaced fully and recognized her face, had felt worth every sacrifice. She thought now about those windows, how they had been getting shorter, how her mother had seemed not better but differently, altered not the confusion of illness but the specific vagueness of someone whose thoughts were being managed rather than healed. The difference between a mind fighting its way back and a mind being held underwater at a depth where drowning was survivable but surfacing was not permitted. Then she thought about what COA had confirmed the previous night, that she had been watching Amber for 2 years, monitoring her contracts, her movements, her mother's medical situation, which meant COA had known about Dorothy Scott's treatment long before the Obsidian Room. Had known, and had done nothing to stop it, because a woman with a sick, sedated mother and a mountain of medical debt was a woman who needed money badly enough to be steered. Dr. Osei was not treating her mother. Dr. Osei was being paid to manage her. The grief that moved through Amber then was not the soft, wet kind. It had no tears in it. It arrived already crystallized, cold and geometric and sharp at every edge, the kind of grief that has been compressed by rage into something far more durable than sorrow, something that could be used. She stood at the window and looked out at the grounds, manicured, beautiful, contained within stone walls that had been designed to look like architecture rather than enclosure. A garden that knew it was a cage. Trees planted at intervals that suggested freedom while providing none. The room around her rearranged itself in her perception. The silk sheets, the curated warmth. The whiskey poured without asking. The fire that had been lit before they arrived. The measured distance that Seowa had maintained close enough to feel like intimacy, far enough to feel like choice. Every detail reassembled with the new knowledge sitting underneath it like a fault line. And Amber felt the ground of her own judgment shift in a way that was genuinely humbling. She had been moved like a piece, by a woman whose hands she had let touch her face and had not pulled away from, because something in her had wanted to trust the touch, had been hungry for it, even the specific hunger of a person who has been alone with their intelligence for so long that being recognized by someone equally sharp feels indistinguishable, briefly, from being safe. That was the trap, not the sedan, not the safe house, not even the files. The trap was the moment Sioa had looked at her across that restaurant table, not as a waitress, not as an instrument, but as a person, and Amber had felt, for the first time and longer than she could honestly measure, entirely seen. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window. Outside, 2 men she hadn't noticed before were visible now near the garden wall. Not gardeners. Their stillness was the wrong kind, watchful rather than idle, positioned rather than wandering. She counted the angles they covered between them, every exit. She breathed against the glass and watched her breath cloud and clear, and she made herself think about her mother's voice dissolving on the word, times 2 years, times the way forgetting had been installed in her like software, rather than grown there like disease, cold grief. Cold rage. Cold, precise, and entirely focused. She was not a guest. She was a resource with a time limit, housed in comfort because distressed assets were harder to operate. Kept warm and apparently free, because a bird that believed in its cage flew less frantically than one that knew. Her father had left her the files. He had also, she now understood, left her the key to something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with Sioa's syndicate or Silas's shell companies or 19 years of buried transactions. He had left her a way out. She just needed 47 hours to find it before anyone realized she'd stopped being grateful for her cage. They moved her on the second morning. No explanation offered. None requested. This was the grammar of Sioa's world, Amber had learned, where information was distributed on a need-to-know basis, and the definition of need was controlled entirely by one woman in a black blazer who had not once, in the 36 hours Amber had known her, appeared to require sleep. The penthouse occupied the uppermost floor of a tower in the Gangnam district that had no signage at street level and no listing in any commercial registry Amber would have been able to access from a civilian terminal. The elevator required a biometric scan and a code, and the code changed. She clocked the keypad display resetting as the doors closed behind them, a 4-second window, a 6-digit sequence she had already memorized without appearing to look. Marcus Scott's voice, quiet as a tide. The room is always telling you something. Your only job is to listen. The penthouse listened back. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. Soul spread below them like a living diagram. 10 million lights arranged in the logic of a circuit board. Arterial roads carrying current between nodes of commerce and power. Every intersection a decision point. Every dark gap between buildings. A place where official maps ran out and other jurisdictions began. She had looked at this city from the ground for 7 months. From up here, its architecture was naked and legible, every system visible, every current traceable back to its source. A workstation had been prepared. A single desk positioned to face the city, a laptop already open, its screen casting pale light against the dark. Beside it, a glass of water and a silence that meant, begin. The Black Ledger's encryption was her father's work, which meant it was, in the most intimate sense, a language she had grown up speaking without knowing it had a name. He had built it across 19 years of refinement, layered authentication, biometric triggers nested inside logical sequences, each gate requiring not just access credentials but a specific order of approach, like a piece of music that only unlocked its meaning when played in the precise key he had chosen. Sitting down at the desk and resting her fingers on the keys, she thought it was the most honest thing he had ever made. The fullest version of his mind she had ever been permitted to see. She felt grief move through her, brief, clean, acknowledged and set aside. Then she began. The work was real. She was not pretending to engage with it. The architecture demanded genuine navigation, and she gave it genuine navigation, moving through the outer authentication layers with the careful, unhurried confidence of someone walking a path they laid themselves. Which, in every meaningful sense, she had. What she was not doing was moving toward the destination they believed she was moving toward. 3 layers deep, in a sequence that would appear to any observer as standard decryption progression, she began building something else entirely, threading it into the existing code the way Marcus had taught her to hide corrections in a balance sheet, present and functional, and completely invisible, unless you knew precisely what shape the absence should have taken. A logic bomb. Patient, quiet, and already counting. She felt Sioa before she heard her. The warmth arrived first, a shift in the air at her back, the particular disruption of proximity, close enough that Amber's shoulders registered it before her mind did. Then, the scent, that dry, dark signature, and underneath it tonight something warmer, a note that lived closer to the skin. Sioa placed both hands on the back of Amber's chair, not touching her, the chair between them like the last remaining formality in a room that had been quietly dismantling formality since they arrived. "The outer gates," she said, her voice low and close, her breath grazing the curve of Amber's ear. "You moved through them faster than I expected." "I told you what I was," Amber said. Her fingers continued moving across the keys, steady, metronomic, betraying nothing. You did. A pause, weighted with something Amber was not ready to examine directly. Your father took 6 months to build the first layer. You read it in 40 minutes. He taught me the language. I just speak it faster. Siwa was quiet for a moment. The city burned below them, indifferent and luminous, knowing nothing about the 2 women in the tower above it, and the thing being built in the silence between them. When this is done, Seowa said, her voice dropping into that register that had nothing professional left in it, low and deliberate, and directed with the precision of someone who understood exactly what frequency they were transmitting on, I can give you. A life that doesn't require hiding what you are. Amber's fingers did not pause. Describe it, she said, not because she believed it. Because she needed Seowa talking, present, focused on the architecture of the promise rather than the architecture of the screen. And Seowa described it. Standing behind her in the dark glass room above the city, her voice painting futures with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to making the impossible sound like an itinerary travel, security, resources without ceiling, work that was never again subject to the approval of men who feared what she could find. A life commensurate with her actual dimensions, rather than the reduced version the world had always required her to perform. It was, Amber thought distantly, a genuinely beautiful lie. She worked for 4 more hours. Seowa moved through the penthouse behind her, sometimes close, sometimes distant, sometimes standing at the glass with a glass of whiskey, watching the city like a general reading a battlefield. Twice she leaned over Amber's shoulder to observe the screen, and both times Amber felt the proximity as a physical pressure against her own composure, the warmth, the dry, dark scent, the specific gravitational quality of a person who occupied space like they had decided to, rather than simply ended up there. Both times she kept her breathing even, and her expression neutral, and her hands performing exactly the work they were meant to perform, while her mind held the other work, the hidden work, the counted sequence, the thing she had built in the negative space of her father's cathedral with the quiet ferocity of someone carrying a flame through wind. By the 3rd hour she had the logic bomb fully integrated. By the 4th it was locked, timed, and entirely undetectable without the specific key her father had given her in the last document he'd ever sent her a birthday message, 3 weeks before he died. That she had read as sentiment and now understood as instruction. She sat back, rolled her shoulders, reached for the water glass, let her body perform the exhaustion of completion because it was also real. The exhaustion. Her mind had been burning at full capacity for 4 hours and her body knew it. Seowa appeared at her shoulder immediately. Where are we? The warmth again. The voice at the register that asked more than it said. Amber looked at the screen, at the final gate, sitting open and waiting. The inner chamber of her father's life's work visible and accessible and ready to be entered. 1 step from the end, she said. Seowa's hand came to rest on her shoulder light. Warm, the ring cold against the fabric of Amber's shirt. A touch that was possession disguised as tenderness, and Amber felt it for both things simultaneously. Felt the complicated heat of it, and the complicated rage of it, occupying the same space inside her chest, without resolution. Then rest, Seowa said. Tomorrow, we finish it. Tomorrow, Amber thought, looking at the city below at all those lights running where the architecture directed them. Tomorrow, the architecture changes. He came at noon, which said everything about him. Midnight was for people who understood that power operated best in darkness, in the hours when the city's official version of itself had gone to sleep, and its true version was free to conduct its business. Noon was for men who believed their arrival was an event, who wanted witnesses, wanted the theater of daylight, wanted the world to observe them walking into a room and know that the room had been waiting. Silas Thorne arrived with 6 men and the particular energy of someone who had already written the ending of the scene in his head and was simply arriving to perform it. Amber heard them before she saw them. The elevator mechanism engaging, the specific weight of multiple bodies redistributing across the penthouse floor as they filed in, the sounds of a room being occupied rather than entered. She was at the workstation, the laptop open, the final gate of the black ledger still sitting at the threshold she had stopped at the night before. She did not turn around immediately. Marcus Scott's voice, "The person who turns first gives away the most." When she did turn, Silas was already looking at her with the expression of a man crossing something off a list. He was immaculate in a gray suit, his cologne arriving ahead of him as always, that ferrous sweetness. Blood beneath bergamot, cloying and familiar, and now almost comforting in the way that confirmed dangers were comforting, because at least they were known. Behind him, his men arranged themselves with the practiced geometry of people paid to fill space threateningly. "You've been useful," he said to Amber. The past tense was not accidental. She held his gaze. Let him read whatever he needed to read in her face. Composure looked different things to different people. To frightened people, it looked like courage. To dangerous people, it sometimes looked like an invitation. Silas. Sioa's voice came from the far end of the penthouse. She was standing at the glass, her back to the room, looking at the city below. She had not turned when the elevator opened. She did not turn now. "We had an arrangement," Silas said. "We did," Sioa agreed pleasantly. What happened next happened in the compressed, elastic time of violence where seconds expand to accommodate everything that occurs within them, and the mind processes it in fragments, non-linearly, sensation before sequence. Sioa turned. She was wearing white, a structured white suit, clean as a verdict, that absorbed the noon light coming off the city below and gave nothing back. Her expression was the most terrifying thing Amber had ever seen on a human face, because it contained no terror at all, no anger, no urgency, no performance of any kind, just the focused, unhurried clarity of a person who has arrived at a moment they have been moving toward for a very long time. "The arrangement," she said, walking toward the center of the room with her hands at her sides, "was always for your benefit, Silas, not mine." He read it half a second too late, the half second that cost him everything. Her people came from the service corridor, from the secondary stairwell, from the utility spaces that decorative architecture conceals and tactical architecture exploits. 6 of his men. 4 points of entry. The math resolved itself in under 90 seconds with the brutal efficiency of an equation that had been solved in advance, every variable accounted for, every contingency absorbed into the planning before the day began. Amber pressed herself against the workstation and watched Sioa move through it. She did not hide. She stood at the edge of the chaos and watched the woman she had been afraid of and deceived by and, in some complicated layer of herself she had not yet finished excavating, drawn to watch her operate with a precision that was almost architectural, directing the dismantling of Silas Thorne's immediate empire with the same controlled authority she brought to everything, as though violence and business occupied the same register for her and always had. Silas made it to the elevator. Almost. Sioa reached him at the threshold, and this part Amber would return to later, in the private hours, when the night asked her to reconstruct what she had witnessed, not because of the violence of it, but because of the specific quality of Sioa's stillness in that final moment. The way she stood in front of him with her white suit already marked with the evidence of the last 90 seconds, her breathing even, her hands steady, looking at him the way you look at something you have been carrying for a long time and are finally setting down. "You used my father's debt against him for 11 years, she said. Her voice was conversational, the most frightening register she possessed. "You built your empire on the ledger he kept, and the secrets it contained, and the people it implicated. You believed that made you safe." Silas said something. The words didn't reach Amber across the penthouse, but she watched his face form them, the desperate vocabulary of a man who has run out of leverage and is attempting to manufacture more from nothing. Sioa listened, gave him the courtesy of it. Then she leaned close and said something in return that Amber couldn't hear, and whatever it was, it left him with nothing. She saw it happen. Saw the last negotiating position collapse behind his eyes, like a structure whose load-bearing wall had just been removed. It was over quickly after that. The penthouse settled. The city below continued its indifferent rhythm, traffic moving through its arteries in the steady pulse of a place that had absorbed worse and continued anyway. Soa stood in the center of the room. The white suit bore its evidence in abstract geometry, particular red that belongs to finality, distributed across the fabric in patterns that looked almost deliberate, as though violence had been applied with the same curatorial precision she applied to everything else. Her hair had not moved. Her breathing had returned to its standard register. She looked at Amber across the length of the penthouse with an expression that contained multitudes and offered none of them up easily. Amber looked back. She was aware of her own heartbeat, in a way she had not been for the last 90 seconds, as though her body had suspended its own maintenance during the crisis, and was only now resuming it, reclaiming ordinary sensation. Pulse, breath, the floor solid under her feet, the city light warm against the glass behind her. Seoa walked toward her, slowly. The way she always moved, as though she had decided to arrive and was simply completing the decision. She stopped 2 feet away. Up close, the evidence on the white suit was impossible to aestheticize. It was what it was, and Seoa wore it without apology, without performance, not proud, not ashamed, simply present in the full, unedited reality of what she was and what she had done, looking at Amber with something in her eyes that had no tactical function whatsoever, something that looked unmistakably and inconveniently like devotion. "I was never going to let him touch you," she said. The words were quiet, absolute, stripped of everything except their own weight. Amber's jaw tightened. The logic bomb was still counting in the architecture of the Black Ledger. Her mother was still sedated in a private ward. She was standing in a penthouse above Seoul with a woman in a blood-marked white suit who had just dismantled an empire and was looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a turning world. The complications were enormous. The feelings underneath them were larger. She held Seoa's gaze and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required, not agreement, not forgiveness, not the capitulation that the devotion in those dark eyes was quietly requesting. Just this. Just the charged and terrible honesty of 2 people standing in the aftermath of something irreversible, each knowing exactly what the other had done, and neither yet knowing what came next. The penthouse had been cleaned with the efficiency of people who had cleaned rooms like this, before surfaces restored, evidence removed, the space returned to its curated stillness, as though the last 90 minutes had been a weather event rather than a reckoning. Only the smell remained, faint and copper-edged beneath the recycled air, the kind of thing that cleaning addressed but could not fully erase. Amber sat at the workstation. Seoa had changed. She stood now at the far end of the room in a charcoal shirt, her hair pulled back, the white suit gone disposed of with the same absence of ceremony she applied to everything that had served its purpose. She held a fresh glass of whiskey and watched Amber at the screen with the patient intensity of someone observing the final movement of a very long piece of music. The Black Ledger's final gate was open. Everything, her father, had built 19 years of syndicate architecture. Every transaction, every buried debt, every name that powerful people had paid enormously to keep out of the light, sat accessible and waiting on the other side of a single keystroke. Amber looked at the screen. She thought about her mother's voice, dissolving on the word times 2 years. She thought about the cold silk sheets. She thought about Seoa's finger tracing her jaw and the devotion in her eyes 40 minutes ago, standing in the wreckage of Silas Thorne's men. And the way both things, the manipulation and the feeling, had existed simultaneously and honestly, which was somehow worse than if the feeling had been entirely fabricated. She thought about her father, who had spent 19 years keeping secrets for people who did not deserve the keeping, and had spent the last years of his life building a different kind of architecture, entirely one nobody had been meant to find until the right moment. She pressed enter. For 3 seconds, nothing visible happened. Then the screen began to change. Not the dramatic cascade of a Hollywood depiction, no collapsing numbers, no flashing warnings. What happened was quieter and more absolute than theater. Progress indicators appearing in sequence, transaction routing confirmations generating in a cascade of dispassionate green text, account structures dissolving and reforming, their contents redirected along channels her father had spent 2 years laying before he died, each one leading not to a single destination, but to a distributed network of recipients, a global victims fund, structured and legally insulated, and already receiving, in real time, the first transfers of assets that had been built on other people's losses. It was not a bank account. It was a wiper worm, patient, comprehensive, and already eating. Amber sat back. The green text continued its quiet work. She watched it the way you watch something inevitable, not with triumph, because triumph required a version of this moment that hadn't cost everything it had cost, but with the specific satisfaction of a mechanism functioning exactly as designed, her father's final act. Her delivery of it, she became aware of the silence behind her. She turned. COA was laughing. It was not the laugh Amber expected, not rage dressed as amusement, not the brittle performance of a person concealing devastation behind noise. It was genuine, low and real, and arriving from somewhere deep enough to be involuntary, the laugh of a person who has reached the end of a very long game and found the final move elegant regardless of who played it. She set her whiskey glass down. "Your father's daughter," she said, and the admiration in it was unambiguous and entirely without comfort. Amber's jaw tightened. "It's done. Whatever you do next, the transfers are already routing. You can't reverse." "I know." Seoa walked toward her, unhurried, hands loose at her sides. "I anticipated a betrayal. I didn't know its shape, but I knew it was coming." She stopped 6 feet away. "I should have built for a larger variable. Then it's over." Not quite. The 2 words arrived with a weight that reorganized the air between them. Seoa reached into her shirt, pocket, and placed her phone on the workstation beside the laptop. The screen was already open to a live feed, grainy, low resolution, the specific visual quality of a camera operating in low light in an enclosed space. Amber registered the image in pieces: metal walls, condensation, the orange geometry of industrial lighting, a shipping container, and inside it, seated with his wrists bound and his head down but visibly breathing, a man she recognized from the angle of his shoulders alone before she even reached his face: her brother, Kofi, 26 years old, a graduate student in London, who called her every Sunday at noon and complained about British weather, and had been, as far as she had known with absolute certainty until this moment, entirely safe. "He arrived in Seoul 4 days ago," Soa said. Her voice had returned to its controlled register, not cold, not cruel, something more precise than either. The voice of a person presenting terms. "He was intercepted at the airport. He doesn't know where he is. He hasn't been harmed." Amber was standing. She had not decided to stand. Her body had made the decision without consulting her, rising to meet the threat with the instinctive verticality of something cornered. "The container," Seoa continued, "is positioned on a barge on the Han River. If the diverted funds do not return to their original routing within 5 minutes, the container enters the water." The green text was still running on the laptop screen. Amber could see it in her peripheral vision, her father's wiper worm doing its patient, comprehensive, irreversible work, each completed transfer a door closing behind her. Irreversible. She had built it that way deliberately. Had understood, when she threaded it into the ledger's architecture, that the point of no return was the point, that half measures in this world were the same as surrender, only slower. She looked at the phone screen. At Kofi's shoulders, rising and falling with the steady rhythm of someone trying to control his fear with his breathing. She had taught him that. Years ago, when their father's absences had grown longer and their mother's worry had grown louder, and Amber had been the one to sit with him in the dark and say, 4 breaths. And then we think, 4 breaths. She looked at Seoa. Seoa looked back, and there it was again beneath the precision, beneath the leverage, beneath the architecture of coercion she had constructed, with the same meticulous care she applied to everything, that thing that had no tactical function. That looked like devotion and hurt like a wound, and was, Amber understood now with the full force of the complication, entirely real, which made it the most dangerous thing in the room. "You anticipated the betrayal," Amber said. Her voice was steady. "But you didn't stop it." Something moved in Sioa's expression. Subtle, load-bearing. "No," she admitted. "You let me do it." The silence lasted 4 seconds. On the phone screen, Kofi shifted his weight. The barge moved almost imperceptibly on the river's current, and the container moved with it. 4 minutes and 30 seconds, Sioa said softly. Amber looked at the screen. At the green text. At everything her father had spent the last years of his life building toward, running its course in real time. And her brother's life suspended above dark water on the other side of a clock that was already counting. The world compressed to a single point. She sat back down, and she began to type. She typed with the focused economy of someone who understood that every second was load-bearing. Sioa stood behind her close, that dry, dark scent a constant in Amber's peripheral awareness. Warm breath and cold patience, and that gravitational quality she carried everywhere. The sense of a person who occupied their own certainty the way most people occupied rooms. Amber felt all of it. Registered all of it. Filed it precisely where it belonged present, acknowledged, and entirely subordinate to what her fingers were doing on the keys. The clock on the phone screen counted. 4 minutes. 3:40. 3:20. The green text of the wiper worm was still running in the background, her father's architecture doing its patient, comprehensive work. Each completed transfer, a door closing, each closed door, a piece of something larger assembling itself quietly in the dark. She had built the logic bomb with a second chamber. Sioa had anticipated a betrayal and prepared a contingency. What Sioa had not prepared for was the possibility that the betrayal had its own contingency nested inside it, the way Marcus had always nested his corrections invisible, present, already counting. 3 minutes. Amber's hands were steady. Her jaw was set. The Han River ran through the city in a dark arterial line, and somewhere on that river a barge carried a shipping container, and inside that container a man sat with bound wrists and controlled breathing. And she typed. 2 minutes 30. At 2 minutes and 12 seconds, she stopped. The screen had resolved to a single confirmation, prompt one keystroke from completion, the reversal of the transfers, the return of the assets to their original routing. Her father's wiper worm paused at the threshold of its final sequence like a held breath. Amber sat very still. Behind her, Sioa leaned forward, drawn by the stillness, by the stopped hands, by the specific quality of a pause that felt different from hesitation. Her presence arrived at Amber's shoulder, warm and close. And Amber felt the exact moment Sioa's eyes reached the screen, and read what was there, and began to understand that the geometry of the room had just changed. Amber turned her head. The distance between them was nothing. Inches, the charged and breathless interval between a question and its answer. Up close, in the cold silver light of the screen, Sioa's face was exactly as it always was. Half illuminated, half shadow, the tattoos at her throat alive with her breathing, those dark eyes holding their complexity without apology, the devotion and the danger occupying the same space without contradiction. Amber held her gaze, and then she leaned in deliberately, slowly, echoing the geometry of that first evening in the restaurant with the precision of someone who remembered everything until her lips were at the curve of Sioa's ear and her voice arrived barely above silence. In Korean, each syllable placed with the care of a woman who understood that language was the sharpest instrument available. Hana pajin ge iseo, gyongchal I ania. Seju jon e interpol e jon hwaha seo. You forgot one variable. I didn't call the police. I called Interpol 3 weeks ago using the evidence my father had already compiled and encrypted inside a secondary partition of the ledger. The partition you never knew existed. The silence lasted exactly long enough. Then the elevator opened. They came in organized waves, tactical entry, coordinated and efficient. The kind of movement that had been rehearsed until it became reflex. Interpol identification. Weapons drawn but controlled. Voices, issuing commands in 3 languages simultaneously, with the calm authority of people who had been waiting for this moment with considerably more patience than the 5 minutes Seoa had allocated for her. Countdown. Seoa did not run. She straightened, stepped back from Amber with the composed dignity of someone who had always known this ending existed in the probability set and had simply bet against it. Her expression cycled through something not defeat, not shock, something more interior and more honest than either. The look of a brilliant person acknowledging a move they should have seen. She looked at Amber, on the phone screen. The shipping container opened from the outside. The man who stepped out was not frightened. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the immediate purposeful efficiency of someone who had been in position rather than in danger, reaching for the communications device at his collar before his feet were fully on the deck. Speaking in clipped operational language to a receiver Amber couldn't hear. His wrists were bound with zip ties. He severed himself with a blade produced from inside his jacket. The footage had been real, the container, the barge, the binding, but the man inside it had put himself there. Undercover. Tactical lead. The kidnapping, a controlled sting. Constructed and staffed. And waiting for the moment, Amber's signal confirmed the assets were in motion. Kofi was in London. He had been in London the entire time. Amber exhaled once long and complete. The breath of a woman releasing something she had been carrying at full tension for 72 hours. Then she reached for the phone. Within the hour, the hospital called without prompting. A new medical team had arrived to assess her mother, dispatched by an oversight body whose involvement had been triggered automatically by the evidence package Amber had routed through. Interpol's Financial Crimes Division 3 weeks ago. The same package that had mapped Dr. Osei's payments, the sedative protocol, the chain of authorization that led back through 3 shell accounts to the same syndicate architecture her father had spent 19 years documenting. The sedation was being reversed. Her mother would need time. But she would surface. She would remember. Amber stood at the penthouse glass while the operation concluded around her, the organized, procedural dismantling of everything Seoa had built in this space. Each piece catalogued, each person processed, the machinery of consequence doing its unhurried work. She watched the Han River in the distance and thought about her father building his cathedral of secrets with the full knowledge that his daughter was the only one who could read the architecture he had left her. He had not been. Preparing her for a career. He had been preparing her for this. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and allowed herself, briefly, the full weight of what it had cost, every sleepless calculation, every controlled breath over evidence she couldn't yet use, every moment of Seoa's proximity that had been genuinely felt and genuinely dangerous and was now genuinely gone. Across the room, Seoa was being processed. And for just a moment, one unguarded moment before the discipline reasserted itself, Amber let herself feel the full, unedited truth of it. That the woman being led away had seen her completely, had wanted her in whatever complicated, weaponized way she was capable of wanting. That the devotion had been real even when everything around it was constructed. It didn't change anything, but it cost something to let it go. She kept her gaze on the river until the feeling passed. Then she straightened, picked up her phone, and walked toward the elevator without looking back. 6 months later, the beach had no name on any map she could find, which was precisely why she had chosen it. White sand, impossible water, the kind of blue that made the Seoul skyline feel like a memory from someone else's life. She had a small house set back from the shore, a reliable internet connection, and contract work that came through a law firm whose partners knew exactly what she was capable of and paid accordingly. Her mother sat in the garden most mornings with her coffee, her clarity restored in increments not linear, not complete, but present. Growing, Kofi called on Sundays. Complained about British weather. She let him. She was on the sand when the package arrived. No postage, no return address. Set at the edge of her towel with the quiet precision of something placed rather than delivered, by hands she had not seen and could not account for, on a beach that should have been impossible to find. Inside, a single sugar cube, scorched at one corner. burgundy dark, and carrying that dry, dark signature she had never fully stopped recognizing. And a phone. It rang before she finished looking at it. She knew the voice before it arrived. Some frequencies were not erasable. They lived in the body rather than the memory, and the body kept its own counsel. Your calculation was almost perfect, Amber. Low, controlled. That register between professional and something raw, the voice that had promised her futures in a glass-walled room above a city that burned like a circuit board. But you forgot. I never stay bankrupt for long. The line remained open. The ocean moved in its patient rhythm against the shore, indifferent, luminous, entirely willing to wait. Amber looked at the scorched sugar cube in her palm, at the water. At the horizon, where the blue of the sky met the blue of the sea in a line so clean it looked like a decision, she raised the phone to her ear and said nothing. Because some responses were worth more as silence, and because the woman on the other end of the line knew, with the same accuracy she brought to everything, exactly what that silence meant. The game, it turned out, had one more move. It always did. Seowa just called. And we all know Amber's going to answer. 6 months of silence, one scorched sugar cube, and a phone that rang like a verdict. This story is nowhere near finished. Subscribe and turn on notifications because what Seowa has been building while Amber played it safe on that beach is about to change everything. Drop a comment. Would you have answered the phone or let it ring? Like this video if Amber's cold, ruthless brilliance had you completely undone from Chapter 1. The next chapter drops soon. You are not ready for what comes next. See you there.